Everyone says pushing the f-pawn is suicide, but in the king's gambit, it's the start of one of the most aggressive openings in chess. What looks like a deadly mistake is actually the key to taking control of your opponent from the second move. It all starts with e4, e5, and the gambit appears with the move f4. If you don't understand this move, you'll keep thinking that pushing the kingside pawn is just asking to lose. But what makes this move so special? It's because white sacrifices the pawn on purpose, and that's what we call a gambit, giving up material to gain something much bigger. In this case, the compensation is that white speeds up development and gains stronger control of the center. The strongest move for black is to accept the gambit. But let me show you something most players don't notice. There's also a line where black declines the gambit and it hides a trap even more dangerous than accepting. We'll get there soon, but once you see it, you'll understand why so many players think they're playing it safe by declining and end up losing even faster. Here, after the gambit is accepted, we're already trading a central pawn for a side pawn. You play knight to f3, stopping queen to h4, which can be really annoying. If you make another developing move, like knight to c3, you end up allowing queen to h4 with check. You can't play pawn to g3 to cover the check because everything on the king side just collapses. In that case, you'd have to walk the king over to e2. So this check is something you have to watch out for in every line of the king's gambit, and that's why knight to f3 is so important right away. And keep this in mind. Knight to f3 isn't just a defensive move, it's also the key that opens the door to white's next attack. Now, white wants to play d4, taking the center with pawns and setting up a way to win back the pawn on f4. There's also the possibility of white going bishop to c4, giving the king on f1 a safe square in case black tries queen to h4 check. We're looking at a deep theoretical line, studied by masters and also played by amateurs. But there's a detail almost no one talks about. The stats show that white wins way above average in this position. Why does that happen if the gambit looks so risky? That's another point I'll reveal in just a bit. However, since this line isn't played very often, we're going to focus on the move I believe is most comfortable for you, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate player just now learning the king's gambit. Knight to f3. That way, you don't have to play the rest of the game with your king stuck in the center. Here, black defends the pawn with pawn to g5. It's a move that weakens the king side. Still, it's widely considered the strongest response. A lot of players see this move and think, that's it, the king's gambit is refuted. But that's exactly where the danger lies, because all it takes is one miscalculated detail, and this same defense turns into poison for the player who tries it. This is almost a refutation of the king's gambit. However, black has to play this with extreme precision, and there will be many chances for mistakes along the way. And this is the first thing you need to pay attention to. The more precise your opponent has to be, the more likely they are to slip up. There are two main moves here. The first is h4, aiming to destabilize the pawn chain. The second, more common at the amateur level, but much less so among stronger players, is bishop to c4. Between the two, I recommend the h4 lines, which I believe are the strongest. Because if you go bishop to c4, you give your opponent a chance to stabilize the position by fianchettoing the dark squared bishop to g7. In other words, it looks elegant, but in practice, you're the one giving up the initiative to black. And here, after any continuation, let's say you castle to put pressure on this beautiful open file and start targeting f7, black plays h6, and suddenly this turns into a solid fortress. So if you go bishop to c4 and black knows how to handle it, you're allowing a very comfortable position. It's the kind of move that looks promising, but ends up building exactly the wall your opponent was hoping for. On the other hand, the move h4 immediately strikes at the pawn chain and doesn't give black any time to react. This is where the game shifts. Instead of accepting the wall, you attack its foundation before it can even stand. If they take the pawn, not only can you recapture right away, but the pawn on f4 becomes an extremely weak target. Black may be up 2 pawns, but those pawns are doubled and isolated. You have space on the king side, and for example, the move d4 here wins back the pawn on f4, and that pawn ends up being more of a headache for black to defend than a real advantage. There's no way to stabilize the pawn chain because a move like h6 immediately loses to h takes g5. If black decides to take back here, they fall into a trap. The pawn is pinned, and that turns the move into a serious blunder, practically handing over the game. White is already winning. Here comes the first reward. What looked solid turns out to be a clear trap, and you start to feel like the game is already in your hands. And if black tries to stabilize again with a move here, pawn to f6 leads to a mating sequence, and white doesn't always find the strongest continuation. Knight takes on g5. It's a knight sacrifice that comes with the threat of queen to h5 check. If black accepts the knight, the queen jumps to h5 with check, and the game is over. White is already winning here, and it's likely to lead to checkmate, even if it's not strictly forced. So the king steps to e7, you take the pawn with check, and the king drops back to d8. That's the safest move black has. But notice, safe here doesn't really mean safe. It's just the least painful path. If black tries any other move here, checkmate comes even faster. The trick is playing queen to h5 with check again. It's not a pointless repetition. It's a trap to force the king to step onto e7, where you finish with queen to e5 check. From there, you force the black king to f7, follow up with bishop to c4, and black's only hope is to play pawn to d5, and after you capture, they sacrifice the queen. If they don't sacrifice the queen, a forced checkmate sequence follows. The key here isn't memorizing the line, it's understanding the position. The black king ends up trapped in the center with no mobility, and that alone guarantees the advantage. So after h5, the king steps to h6, and you can already see that any check against this exposed king is going to be checkmate. You can play d4, aiming for a later checkmate, or you can force the line with queen to f4. Black has to block the check. You take the bishop with check, and after queen to g7, the move d3 or even d4 uncovers checkmate against your opponent's king. And it's exactly moments like this that keep the King's Gambit enchanting players for generations. In just a few moves, the opponent's confidence turns into inevitable defeat. Now we move on to the next line. After white plays h4, black should immediately push the pawn and drive away the knight. Here you play knight to e5, aiming to win the pawn back. You've gambited a pawn, and by move 4 or 5, black is already forced to return it. Any move trying to hold on to that pawn simply doesn't work. It's attacked twice and defended 0 times. So knight to e5 is the natural follow-up, recovering the sacrificed pawn. And here's something curious. By move 5, black already has no real choice. And when your opponent has no choice, that's when hidden mistakes tend to show up. For example, the move d6, which looks like it defends the pawn and is actually the main line, doesn't really hold it. Your knight can simply retreat and capture on g4, and you're back in the main line with equal material. Now, watch this closely. The most common mistake for black is to capture the knight. It feels natural, but it actually makes things worse. Your queen becomes centralized, you get instant pressure on f4, and the entire kingside becomes vulnerable. Then, after d4, you recover your material. Even if black plays knight to f6, your queen sits comfortably on f3, and your position remains very pleasant. The best response for black would be bishop to e7, a rare move in practice, barely mentioned even in theoretical manuals. Still, white remains totally comfortable. The usual follow-up is queen to f3, targeting h4. If black tries to give a check, there are few ways to respond, blocking with the knight or moving the king to d1, though blocking with the knight is usually the better option. After that, bishop to g3 follows. And this is one of those key moments where most casual players lose track, simply because they don't know this less obvious path. From here, the game becomes very tactical. You'll be putting pressure on the f4 pawn, preparing to castle queenside, and aiming at the isolated pawns on the king side. Black's compensation in this line is simple. They end up a pawn ahead thanks to bishop to e7, followed by bishop takes h4. But realistically, how many of your online opponents do you think will actually find that exact sequence? That's the gap between theory and what really happens over the board. Another option after d6 is to simply sacrifice your knight on f7, and now you're playing with your opponent's king wide open in the center of the board. You'll eventually develop your bishop to c4, and even though there are no pawns in front of your king, you'll still castle kingside. That comes with long-term pressure because your rook lands on f1, directly facing the enemy king. And here's a detail that always makes people stop and think. How can a knight sacrifice end up locking the enemy king in a cage? You'll see in a second how this one shift changes everything. And even though your opponent would actually be better with accurate defense, say if they just brought the king back calmly, What do most players tend to do instead? They often go for something like bishop to e6, and now white is already better because you take the bishop and push the enemy king even further into the center, then start picking off their pawns with checks. Even though you're down a knight, white's position is just better. That's what playing the king's gambit is all about. You've got to enjoy the thrill of sacrificing. Let's take a look at what happens if your opponent declines the king's gambit. There are a few tricks in this line. One of them looks harmless at first, but before you know it, the game's already falling apart. We'll get to that. Declining the gambit with pawn to f6 already loses the game on the spot. You just take the e5 pawn, and if black recaptures, they walk straight into queen to h5 check. A typical reply here is g6. You capture with check, putting pressure on the rook. If they try to defend with the queen and go for a counterattack, hoping to win your rook, you're going to lose your pawn with check. But here's the thing, you're not actually down material. You can play bishop to e2, intentionally hanging your g2 pawn. And when black takes it, trying to even the material, you play bishop to f3, completely shutting down their plan. They'll have to pull the queen back, and at the end of the line, their knight falls too. So in just a few moves, you're up a rook and a knight, not to mention the leading development. What looked like a safe decline just turned into a total disaster. And the best part is, you set the trap yourself, one move at a time. Another way to decline the gambit, and also one of the most common replies, is the move d6. At first glance, it looks solid, but it hides a trap. What black wants is for you to rush and take the pawn on e5. If you do, queen to h4 check comes immediately. You have no choice but to play g3, and the resulting position is uncomfortable. Very similar to a line we saw earlier, just with reverse colors. That's why it's so important not to fall for it. It's the kind of mistake that only needs to happen once for you to remember it forever. The right way to deal with this is to develop the knight to f3. That way, you cover the king's square, prepare short castling, and keep up the pressure. The pawn on e5 isn't going anywhere, but you should only take it when it's really safe. And remember this, when you wait for the right moment, you don't just win the pawn, you win the psychological edge too. But here's the thing, none of this will really help if you keep making those silly mistakes that hand over the game for free. I've been there too. Early on, I lost so many games that way. So I'm putting a video on screen right now where I reveal 3 simple rules every beginner and intermediate player needs to eliminate 99% of their blunders. These are the exact rules I use to convert games into crushing wins with real step-by-step examples that'll make you go, how did I not know this before? Click it now before you leave, or those same tactical patterns will keep catching you off guard. If you like learning something new today and you enjoy the way I break things down, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe because there's a lot more aggressive strategies coming your way. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.